that if we were to rule in your favor about the Federal Trade Commission, put aside these other agencies, just about the Federal Trade Commission, which is the issue that's before us, the entire structure of the government would fall. You want to take a minute to address that?
The court in, I think, Free Enterprise Fund or Seal Law talked about these kind of predictions of doom, and the sky did not fall when the removal restrictions were removed from the CPSC and the PCAOB. So also if the FTC, the MSPB, the NLRB are made subject to political process and the political discipline of being accountable to the president, the sky will not fall. In fact, our entire government will move towards accountability to the people.
Did you watch that exchange? Did you hear what just happened in that courtroom? Because if you blinked, you might have missed the moment when American democracy folded in on itself, like a collapsing star, when 90 years of constitutional architecture built to protect you from the whims of autocrats was dismissed with a shrug and a bloodless abstraction about the sky not falling. And I need you to understand, this is not hyperbole. This is not progressive panic. This is the entire foundation of administrative independence being dynamited in real time, while Justice Samuel Alito lobbed softballs to Trump's attorney like he was throwing batting practice for fascism itself. Alito literally teed up the question for John Sauer, Trump's Solicitor General, asking him directly to respond to claims that their position could cause the entire government to fall, and what did we get in response? This cavalier dismissal that the sky will not fall, and that stripping independence from federal agencies would move the entire government toward accountability to the people, as if consolidating power in the hands of one man, as if making every regulatory body answerable to whatever strong man occupies the Oval Office somehow represents democratic accountability rather than its annihilation. Let me paint you the full horror of what's unfolding, because this goes so much deeper than one clip, so much further than one hearing. This case could transform the federal government and effectively end the independence of some 24 bipartisan agencies that Congress had designed to be insulated from political interference and direct White House supervision. We're talking about the Federal Trade Commissions, the National Labor Relations Board, the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, agencies created over a century of legislative effort to protect workers from exploitation, consumers from corporate predation, citizens from the raw exercise of unchecked power. All 6 of the Supreme Court's conservative justices indicated during oral arguments that a president should have absolute control over the leadership of any government body carrying out executive functions. And when I say all 6, I mean the entire conservative supermajority is locked in formation, marching toward a unitary executive that would have made the founders recoil in revulsion. You want to know what's truly chilling here? What keeps me up at night thinking about the authoritarian future we're hurtling toward? Justice Sonia Sotomayor told Trump's lawyer directly, "You're asking us to destroy the structure of government." And that's not rhetoric from a liberal justice trying to score political points. That's a constitutional scholar looking at the abyss and naming what she sees. Justice Elena Kagan warned that the result would give the president massive, unchecked, uncontrolled power, not only to do traditional execution of the laws, but to make law through regulatory agencies, now utterly subordinate to presidential diktat. Think about what that means. Really sit with the implications. A president who disagrees with environmental regulations can fire the EPA commissioners and install loyalists who will rubber stamp the poisoning of our water. A president hostile to labor can decimate the NLRB and ensure workers have no recourse against corporate abuse. A president who wants to punish critics can weaponize the FTC against companies whose CEOs dare to speak out. And here's the bombshell that should terrify anyone who cares about institutional continuity and the separation of powers. The Supreme Court is set to decide whether to overturn Humphrey's Executor, United States, a landmark 1935 decision that was the culmination of a years-long weakening of that precedent by the court's conservative justices. This isn't some abstract legal theory being debated in ivory towers. This is the systematic dismantling of the administrative state that conservatives have fantasized about for decades, the fulfillment of a project that began in Reagan-era strategy sessions and has now found its ultimate expression in a Supreme Court captured by Federalist Society ideologues who see independent agencies as obstacles to pure executive authority. Supreme Court justices seemed open Monday to overruling a 90-year precedent that has prevented presidents from removing members of independent agencies at will in a case that could reshape the balance of power within the federal government, centered on whether President Trump can fire Rebecca Kelly Slaughter from the FTC, and the details of Slaughter's case illuminate the raw exercise of authoritarian impulse. Trump fired Slaughter without cause even though the 1914 law establishing the FTC states presidents can only remove commissioners for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance. claiming in his termination letter that her continued service was merely inconsistent with his administration's priorities, which is to say he fired her for not being sufficiently loyal, for not bending the knee, for maintaining the independence that Congress explicitly wrote into law. The philosophical architecture undergirding this power grab has a name, and you need to understand its contours, because it's been building for 40 years in conservative legal circles, metastasizing from fringe theory to governing doctrine. The unitary executive theory's central claim is based on Article 2 language, that the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States, and proponents argue this means all executive power, every scintilla of authority in the executive branch must flow through and be controllable by one person. The Reagan administration was the first presidential administration to cite unitary executive theory. Then it entered public discourse with George W. Bush and found a strong advocate in President Donald Trump. But what we're witnessing now is the apotheosis of this doctrine, its transformation from contested theory to constitutional mandate by judicial fiat. Let me be absolutely clear about the stakes here, because I don't want anyone thinking this is some procedural squabble about agency operations. Trump has already fired Gwyn Wilcox from the NLRB, the first board member to be fired in the 90-year history of that agency, an action that caused the board to fall below its quorum and may have violated the National Labor Relations Act itself. All NLRB investigations, including 24 into Elon Musk's companies, cannot move forward until Trump nominates new members. Do you see what's happening? He's not just firing people for cause, he's systematically incapacitating the very agencies designed to check corporate power, and the Supreme Court is poised to give him a constitutional green light to finish the job. The intellectual dishonesty of the conservative justices on this question would be laughable if it weren't so catastrophic for democratic governance. Chief Justice John Roberts said the Humphreys executor precedent had nothing to do with what the FTC looks like today, claiming the FTC of that era had very little, if any, executive power, suggesting the agency has far greater power today, which is a convenient bit of revisionist history that allows him to pretend the principle underlying independent agencies has somehow become obsolete. Roberts called Humphrey's executor a dried husk, as if a unanimous 1935 decision protecting agencies from presidential caprice has simply withered away through neglect rather than being systematically undermined by the very justices now declaring it dead. Conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch said the Humphreys ruling was poorly reasoned and suggested he would vote to overturn it, declaring there's no such thing in our constitutional order as a fourth branch of government that's quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative, which reveals the rigid formalism that animates this whole project. These justices cannot conceive of institutional arrangements that don't fit neatly into their three-boxes civics class understanding of government. So rather than acknowledging that modern governance requires specialized expertise, insulated from day-to-day political pressure, they're bulldozing a century of institutional development to satisfy their originalist theology. And here's where the duplicity becomes almost unbearable. Justice Brett Kavanaugh suggested the Supreme Court is likely to carve out two exceptions, the Federal Reserve Bank and administrative courts like the tax court, and made a point of downplaying potential fallout, stating that overruling or narrowing Humphreys won't affect the existence of these agencies. This is the same Kavanaugh who said the crux of the issue is that officials directing agencies are exercising massive power over individual liberty and billion-dollar industries without being accountable to anyone, conveniently ignoring that these officials are appointed by presidents, confirmed by the Senate, and subject to judicial review. But apparently that's insufficient accountability. What we really need is the ability for presidents to fire anyone who won't implement their agenda, without regard to expertise or the law itself. The trajectory of recent Supreme Court decisions has paved the highway for this authoritarian turn, and understanding that context is essential to grasping how we arrived at this constitutional precipice. During Trump's first term, the Supreme Court chipped away at Humphrey's executor when it permitted Trump to fire the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, holding that firing was permissible because the CFPB is run by a single director rather than a multi-member board, with Roberts describing Humphreys as applying to multi-member agencies that do not wield substantial executive power. See how the ground gets prepared, how each decision narrows the exception until nothing remains but presidential supremacy. In March 2025, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the president could legally remove members of the National Labor Relations Board and the Merit Systems Protection Board because both wield executive power, finding restrictions on the president's removal power unconstitutional, in a ruling seen as a likely precursor to the Supreme Court reviewing its Humphreys executor precedent, and that prediction has now come to fruition. We're watching it happen in real time. The dominoes have been carefully arranged, each one pushing against the next, until the entire edifice of administrative independence collapses into rubble. But let's talk about who benefits from this constitutional revolution, because understanding the material stakes reveals the class warfare embedded in seemingly abstract legal doctrine. The MAGA movement and allied business interests have long targeted federal workers and the agencies where they work as a shadowy, unaccountable deep state, with these government bodies wielding considerable regulatory power that has long been loathed by business interests. This isn't about democratic accountability to the people, as Sauer so disingenuously claimed. This is about corporate accountability to no one, about ensuring that industries can capture the very agencies meant to regulate them by ensuring those agencies answer only to whichever precedent corporations can buy. Think about the practical implications for workers whose organizing rights hang in the balance. The NLRB's leadership, which is central to unfair labor practice standards, remedies, and union election rules, can now be changed by the president without cause, increasing the likelihood of faster policy shifts with changes in administration. We're talking about whiplash governance, where every 4 years the entire apparatus of labor protection can be dismantled and rebuilt, according to presidential preference, where workers attempting to form unions have no stable legal framework to rely on because the rules change based on electoral outcomes rather than legislative deliberation or agency expertise. And the chilling effect on federal employees themselves cannot be overstated. Imagine you're a career civil servant who's devoted decades to environmental protection or financial regulation or workplace safety, and now you know that any decision you make that displeases the current administration could result in your firing if your agency head gets replaced by a loyalist. Independent adjudicators were created by Congress to insulate certain decision-making from the day-to-day influence of the president, because a worker who has been unlawfully fired deserves to have their case heard by an impartial tribunal, not a panel of judges who face termination for enforcing the law against companies owned by presidential allies or donors. This is what we lose when we collapse independence into political subordination. The historical amnesia required to embrace this unitary executive doctrine is staggering when you consider that the founders, emerging from monarchy, deliberately created a system of checks and balances to prevent the concentration of power. In Humphrey's Executor, the Supreme Court unanimously recognized an exception to the president's removal power for multi-member agencies with quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial powers, per understanding that effective governance requires specialized bodies that can operate with some insulation from the political winds. The court held that while the president has the power to remove purely executive officers for any reason, that unlimited power does not extend to agencies like the FTC, whose duties are neither political nor executive, but predominantly quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative. This wasn't some aberration or mistake. This was a considered judgment about how to structure government to serve public rather than merely presidential interests. But now we're being told that 90 years of institutional practice, that decades of congressional intent in creating independent agencies, that the entire architecture of New Deal and post-New Deal governance must give way before the textualist fundamentalism of 6 unelected justices who've decided their reading of the executive power trumps all other considerations. Such a ruling would overrule or substantially limit the unanimous 1935 Supreme Court decision in Humphrey's Executor involving the FTC noun, and the casualness with which these justices contemplate overturning unanimous precedent should alarm anyone who thinks judicial restraint or respect for institutional continuity matters. Let me pivot to the larger pattern here, because this case doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a comprehensive assault on the administrative state that the Roberts Court has been waging for years. The court's 2024 decision in Loper-Bright overturned Chevron deference, ending decades of judicial deference to agencies' reasonable interpretations of ambiguous statutes. And while Chevron deference gave the president significant power to engage in substantive policymaking, the Roberts Court's abandonment of that doctrine was a significant reduction in presidential power. At the same time, the court was increasing presidential power to remove agency heads, so they're simultaneously making it harder for agencies to interpret statutes while making it easier for presidents to fire the people who run those agencies, creating a perfect storm of institutional vulnerability. The court is selectively channeling power, stripping it from agencies themselves while concentrating it in the presidency, and the result is a system where regulatory action becomes nearly impossible unless it has explicit presidential backing, where the entire machinery of government becomes an extension of one person's will rather than a complex system of expertise and deliberation. This is the true genius and horror of the unitary executive doctrine. It doesn't eliminate government power, it just ensures all of it flows through one accountable-to-no-one figure who can ignore institutional norms, fire dissidents, and remake the bureaucracy in his image every single day of his administration. And speaking of Trump specifically, let's be absolutely clear about what he's already done, and what he'll do if the Supreme Court gives him the green light he's seeking. Since January, Trump has also removed Democratic members from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Merit Systems Protection Board, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission, systematically purging anyone who might provide even token resistance to his agenda. Upon taking office, Trump undertook mass firings of federal employees, inspectors general, and members of independent agencies and oversight boards who could attempt to block or constrain his moves, with legal analysts describing such firings as setting up Supreme Court cases that could expand his power over independent executive branch agencies that Congress arranged to be insulated from presidential control. He's not even hiding the strategy. He's deliberately creating constitutional crises to manufacture the cases that will give him the precedents he needs. The ideological genealogy of this moment traces back through decades of conservative legal movement organizing and understanding that history reveals this isn't some spontaneous development, but rather the fruition of a long-term project. The unitary executive theory represents a muscular understanding of presidential Article II powers that developed in the Reagan administration among a group of young attorneys in the Justice Department who thought the presidency had been weakened. And who are those young attorneys now? Justices like Samuel Alito, who held important posts in the Reagan administration, along with justices like Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, who served in later Republican administrations, all now sitting on the Supreme Court advancing the very theories they developed in their youth. And Alito specifically has been a true believer in this doctrine for his entire career. Alito preached the gospel according to OLC, maintaining that the president has the power and the duty to supervise the way in which subordinate executive branch officials exercise the president's power of carrying federal law into execution, pointing out that the Constitutional Convention rejected the concept of a plural executive in favor of a unitary executive. This is his ideological North Star, the principle that animates his entire jurisprudence, and now he has the votes to enshrine it in constitutional law. The political scientists and historians who study Democratic backsliding will look at this moment as pivotal, as the point where American democracy took a decisive turn toward authoritarianism, not through military coup or violent revolution, but through the slow-motion constitutional capture of institutions by ideological zealots who've convinced themselves they're restoring original meaning. Critics point to countries where similar changes to a more unitary executive have resulted in democratic backsliding, noting that the majority of democracies give their executive less power than what's being proposed here. We're embarking on a grand experiment in concentrated power that runs counter to global democratic norms, and we're doing it while telling ourselves it's what the founders intended. The consequences if the Supreme Court rules for Trump will cascade through every corner of American life in ways that are difficult to fully anticipate, but terrifying to contemplate. If the Supreme Court invalidates removal protections for FTC commissioners, such a decision is likely to reach far beyond the commission, because many statutes restrict a president to removing an official for inefficiency, neglect of duty, and malfeasance in office, meaning all other agencies with those words will be in the same boat. We're not talking about tweaking one agency's structure. We're talking about a wholesale transformation of how the federal government operates, a seismic shift that will reverberate for generations. And let's address the breathtaking hypocrisy of conservatives who spent the Obama and Biden years screaming about executive overreach and imperial presidencies, suddenly discovering that actually the president should have near total control over the executive branch. Where were these concerns about unitary executive theory when Obama was trying to protect dreamers or Biden was attempting student loan forgiveness? Oh right, those were lawless exercises of executive authority that had to be checked by courts, but Trump firing commissioners who won't bend to his will, that's just restoring constitutional order. The selective application of these principles reveals them as nothing more than will to power dressed in originalist garb. The liberal justices understand what's at stake here. You can hear the urgency in their questions and the alarm in their warnings. Justice Sonia Sotomayor warned that through this case, the court could dismantle the modern U.S. government, and she's not engaging in hyperbole. She's describing the logical endpoint of the majority's reasoning. Justice Kagan noted there doesn't seem to be a stopping point, that independent agencies wield significant legislative and judicial powers generally exercised by Congress and the judiciary, and giving the president direct control over those agencies risks creating massive, unchecked, uncontrolled presidential power effectively to legislate and judge. This is the fusion of powers that every political theorist from Montesquieu forward has identified as the essence of tyranny. But the conservative majority has already telegraphed where this is going. Throughout oral arguments, the court's Republican-appointed majority appeared to be leaning toward shattering a key limit to the president's ability to influence agencies Congress designed to be insulated from direct White House control, with conservative justices offering little pushback to the administration's claims and largely not voicing concerns about a president having unfettered removal powers. They've already made up their minds. Oral arguments are just theater. The conclusion is foreordained because these justices have been waiting their entire careers to strike this blow against the administrative state. And think about the cynicism required to watch Alito specifically in that clip. The way he frames the question as giving Trump's lawyer a minute to address the concern that their position could cause government collapse, as if he's being fair and balanced rather than teeing up his ideological ally to deliver predetermined talking points. Alito asked Trump's Solicitor General to address Sotomayor's assertion about destroying the structure of government, and Sauer replied that the sky will not fall, and the entire government will move toward accountability to the people. This was coordinated, this was scripted, this was one conservative operative throwing a softball to another while pretending to engage in neutral judicial inquiry. The defenders of this unitary executive doctrine will claim I'm being hysterical, that presidents have always had significant power, and this is just clarifying constitutional ambiguities, but let me be absolutely clear about what's being normalized here. By firing Gwyn Wilcox, Trump is hoping the Supreme Court will overrule 90 years of legal precedent and give him the authority to fire members of independent boards. And once that precedent is established, once we've accepted that independence is unconstitutional and everything must flow through the presidency, there is no limiting principle, there is no check remaining except elections, which themselves become compromised when the agencies that protect electoral integrity answer only to the sitting president. The consequences of the Supreme Court overturning 90 years of precedent protecting the independence of federal agencies would be far-reaching and severe, as Congress has established numerous independent agencies to protect workers, consumers, and the public from discrimination, unfair competition, and corporate wrongdoing, and if Trump is given the green light to fire members of these independent agencies for any reason including merely disagreeing with their decisions, it completely undermines the independence and objectivity of the agencies and leaves them vulnerable to political influence. This is what we're bargaining away in the name of presidential accountability. Let me bring this back to the human dimension, because it's easy to get lost in constitutional abstractions and forget that real people's lives hang in the balance. Workers who try to organize unions will face NLRB boards stacked with management-friendly appointees who can be replaced the moment they issue a pro-labor decision. Consumers seeking protection from predatory financial practices will encounter a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau led by people who can be fired for aggressive enforcement. People breathing polluted air and drinking contaminated water will depend on EPA officials who know their jobs are secure only as long as they don't anger the president by holding corporations accountable. This is the lived reality of unitary executive theory. This is what accountability to the people actually means in practice. And I want to be clear about something else, because I know the cynics and the both-siders will say that Democrats would use these powers too if they had them, that I'm only upset because it's Trump wielding this authority. That's missing the entire point. The problem isn't which party controls the presidency. The problem is concentrating this much power in any single person regardless of party. I don't want Democratic presidents to have the ability to fire Fed governors or NLRB members at will, any more than I want Republican presidents to have it. The whole point of independent agencies is to create stability and expertise that transcends electoral cycles, to build institutions that serve long-term public interest rather than short-term political expedience. But we've arrived at this moment because decades of conservative legal scholarship, billions in dark money funding Federalist Society grooming and Supreme Court capture, and a Republican Party willing to subordinate every principle to the accumulation of power have converged to make this nightmare possible. And make no mistake, what we're witnessing is a nightmare for democracy. It's the constitutional equivalent of removing all the fire breaks from a forest and hoping it never burns. It's dismantling the very structures that prevent democratic systems from sliding into autocracy. The next few months will determine whether we live in a country where institutional independence means anything, or whether we've fully embraced a strongman system where one person's will permeates every corner of government. If the Supreme Court rules for Trump in this case, if they overturn Humphrey's executor and grant presidents the removal power they're seeking, we will have crossed a Rubicon from which there is no easy return. Future presidents will inherit this authority and be tempted to use it, agencies will become completely politicized, and the entire project of expert administration in the public interest will be replaced by governance by presidential whim. That's what was really happening in that clip. That's what Alito's casual question and Sauer's dismissive answer represent. The normalization of authoritarianism, the transformation of exceptional power into ordinary practice, the moment when we shrug and accept that actually the president should control everything, because that's just how government works now. And if we let that become the new normal, if we accept this as inevitable or even desirable, then we will have failed the most basic test of democratic citizenship, which is recognizing tyranny when it's being built, and refusing to let it stand. The sky may not literally fall as Sauer claimed, but the entire architecture of constitutional democracy that keeps us free certainly will collapse, and we'll spend generations trying to rebuild what 6 Supreme Court justices destroyed in their rush to empower an authoritarian president who never should have been anywhere near power in the first place.